Welcome back to Dark Discoveries. I am your host, Dustin, and as always, I am here with
Jimbo.
And for the first time in a while, we're actually together in person.
It's kind of weird, ain't it?
Dude, our rhythm is so bad. Jackie's still off playing actress. By the time you hear this, I'm going to hope that the Hell's Bell play that we did was a smashing success.
That we did?
Well, we didn't do the play, but the talk back with some experts on the case.
Starring Dustin as Bell Gunnis.
You ought to see me with a push-up bra and some heels and some pumps. So, fantastic play that was put on down at Butler University. We were invited to be on a panel with some forensic experts and some experts on the CSI, the crime scene investigating stuff. So, great opportunity, but since this is in the future being delivered and we're recording in the past, it's not actually happened yet.
So we're going back to the future.
Yeah, we're going back in time. But in this case, we're also going back in time and it is the unsolved murder of Ken Rex McElroy. What do they say? How do they pronounce it on Google? McElroy. So we're going to probably just go back with whatever we feel like saying.
I might just call him the young MC.
It's definitely a serial killer vibe with two first names.
Oh, yeah.
It's always a bad idea.
Wait a minute. Don't you have two first names?
Well, I think
Dustin Glenn.
But I don't get referred to as Dustin Glenn.
Not even when you're in trouble with your wife?
No, my wife doesn't use it.
Oh, okay.
But when people refer to you, this is the case of Ken McElroy versus Ken Rex. When they start putting two John Wayne Gacy, they don't call him John Gacy. Ted Bundy, I think, doesn't fall in that one. But there's, serial killers.
They call him Theodore Bundy.
Theodore. But
just start calling Ted Bundy Beaver.
I wanted to make a Leave It to Beaver. Yeah. More, you're being hard on the Beaver, but I'm trying to be professional here, and I go off the rails so easy, as you know. So. But this case of Ken Rex McElroy, he was born in Skidmore, Missouri. Skidmore's kind of a place that just exists quietly on the edge of the map. It's between Kansas City and Omaha, Nebraska. It's a small farming community where life moves at a slower pace and familiarity is unavoidable. The streets are modest, the homes are unassuming, and the rhythm of daily life is shaped by routine, hard work, and the unspoken understanding that everyone knows everybody. And when everybody knows everybody, Jimbo, you know what happens?
You all meet at the local bar and cheers?
You do, but you know everybody's business. Everybody knows what's going on in these towns. In a town like this, reputations aren't built overnight. They grow over the years, and sometimes decades, until they become
inseparable.
I don't know why that word did not look like inseparable from the person themselves. In the quiet rural stretches of northwest Missouri, a boy born into the life that offered very little in the way of opportunities. This boy's name was Ken Rex McElroy. McElroy, however you want to say it. He was born June 6, 1934.
June 16th.
16th. I'm glad you're looking because it's been a long day. The 15th, I think it said. It was like 15 or 17.
I think it's 15 of 16, ain't he?
It's something because...
like when I shoot free throws, I'm 15 out of 16.
Yeah, and that 16 is the misses out of 15 because he probably dropped it before he took his first shot. But there's some other numbers we'll talk about later. That's why it gets a little bit confusing for me.
Dustin, now you have a child. I have two. Can you imagine 16?
It's they know their way out at that point, don't they? But, back then, I know my grandma had 16 brothers and sisters. It was a way of life. You had to have them. You had to have kids to go out, work the fields, or our circumstances, if you're in Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, your kids probably went in the coal mines pretty early. It was survival. You had to get them out there to work to make a living. His parents were poor migrant tenant farmers. Probably a sharecropper is going to be a better word for that. Eventually they settled near Skidmore. The life of, we're just going to call him Ken from here on out. The family was defined by instability, hard labor, low income and constant movement. So they were going from place to place trying to make a living, trying to just survive. In a household this large with, 15, 16 brothers and sisters, attention on the kids are going to be scarce. You're not going to get paid attention to. There's just not enough time in the day. Discipline was inconsistent, and survival took priority over everything else.
From an early age, McElroy existed on the margins. Education, which might have offered structure or direction, never took hold. He dropped out of school at just 15 years old, ending his formal education in the 8th grade. What replaced it was something far less structured and far more dangerous: a growing independence without guidance, accountability, or restraint. Those who knew him in his youth would later recall that he was different. He had a temper and was quick to anger. There were early signs of aggression, of bullying, of someone who didn't respond to authority the way others did. Kind of starting to sound like you, Dustin. This is
Well,
just a little bit,
it was
15 years
ADD.
old and he dropped out of school. You kind of checked out around 15,
Hey,
right?
I
You finished, but you checked out about 15.
just so you know, I made the AB honor roll my senior year.
You made the ADD.
AB honor roll, and ADD probably led to the class choices I took. I didn't take difficult classes; I didn't need to, but I overachieved in those easy classes.
In a small, tight-knit farming community, those behaviors stood out, but they weren't yet seen as a warning of what was to come. Skidmore itself played a role in shaping that trajectory. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where disputes were often handled quietly, and where law enforcement presence was limited. People relied on trust, reputation, and community in order to maintain peace. But those systems only worked when everyone followed the same unspoken rules. And McElroy, even at a young age, showed little interest in doing that.
And as he moved into his teenage years, the line between mischief and criminal behavior, that line began to blur. What may have started as small, opportunistic acts slowly developed into a pattern. There was a sense, even then, that consequences didn't quite reach him the way it did others. Whether it was due to the lack of enforcement, lack of evidence, or simply the reluctance of neighbors to escalate problems, McElroy learned something early that would define the rest of his life. He could push those boundaries, and nothing would stop him. The realization didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, reinforced over time, shaped by his environment, circumstances, and repetition. A boy who grew up in poverty, largely unchecked, increasingly emboldened, was beginning to form into something far more dangerous. Not yet the man in town the town would come later to fear, but already moving into that direction. And in a place like Skidmore, where silence was often replaced by confrontation, that kind of transformation could happen quietly. Well, until it couldn't anymore. You ignore it till it becomes too big of an issue, and you know what happens. By the time you get to that point, it becomes an issue. It's too big of an issue. As Ken Rex McElroy, whatever we're going to call him, moved into adulthood, the shift from petty misbehavior to calculated criminal actively became impossible to ignore.
What had once been a small, isolated incidents began forming a clear and troubling pattern. Livestock started disappearing from local farms, hogs and cattle taken under the cover of night and quickly resold. Grain stores would be found lighter than expected, gasoline siphoned from equipment, tools missing from barns. It wasn't random and it wasn't occasional. It was consistent and targeted. For the farmers and families of Skidmore, these weren't minor inconveniences. This was livelihood, food, income, survival. And while many suspected McElroy, suspicion alone wasn't enough to bring consequences. There were always just enough doubt, just enough distance to keep him from being held accountable. And over time, something shifted, not just in him, but in the town itself. Because when people did confront him, things didn't resolve, they escalated. McElroy developed a reputation not just for theft, but for intimidation. He didn't hide from conflict, he leaned into it. If someone accused him, challenged him, or even spoke against him, he would respond in ways that made it clear the situation was far from over. He would show up at their homes, sometimes armed, sometimes sitting silently in his vehicle for hours, watching, not speaking, not leaving, just making his presence known.
It didn't take long for the people to understand his message. There were reports, some proven, many whispered, of beatings, threats, harassment that were directed to those who crossed him. Property would be damaged or destroyed, barns burnt under suspicious circumstances, animals found shot and killed. Whether every incident could be tied directly to McElroy didn't matter. What mattered was the people believed he was capable of doing it. And once that belief took hold, it changed how the people behaved. Fear became part of everyday life. Parents warned their children about him. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. People altered their routines to avoid crossing his path. In a town built on familiarity, why that's so tough, and trust, McElroy became the exception, the unpredictable element that no one wanted to provoke. And through it all, one lesson kept reinforcing itself in his mind. He could get away with it. Every time he pushed further without consequences, that line moved a little bit further. What once might have been considered too far to become normal, what once might have been triggered a response was now unchallenged. The absence of accountability didn't just allow his behavior, it encouraged it. And by the time the years passed, McElroy was no longer just a man suspected of crimes. He was something else entirely, a presence, a force that shaped how an entire community lived its life. Not because of what he had proven, but because of what people believed he could do and what they feared would happen if they tried to stop him.
Now, I wonder if, the cops could trace back the animal shootings to a gun he owned.
I'm sure they could, but you got to remember this is probably early 40s, 50s, because he was born in the early 30s. Small town, small resources. So ballistics probably wasn't a big thing yet, other than, okay, it looks to be this caliber. He has it. But I think, even the law enforcement, they just didn't have the capabilities to probably give him the attention that he needed. And he just kind of, the buddy system kind of thing too, where it just happens and gets bigger and bigger.
While Ken Rex McElroy built his reputation publicly through intimidation and crimes, his private life revealed a level of control and violence that was, in many ways, even more disturbing. Relationships for McElroy were not built on connection or stability. They were built on dominance. Over the course of his life, he was married multiple times, some reports suggesting as many as 10, and fathered at least 17 children with several wives and other young women and girls. His personal life was not separate from his behavior in the community. It was an extension of it. Now, Dustin, I've been married a long time. You've been married a long time. More than one wife? I don't know, man. I don't know. Right?
Yeah, I'm good with one, but as we go, we're going to learn a little bit more about.
But that also, he probably seen that in his family when he wasn't getting the attention either. That probably just an extenuating circumstance.
I'm married and the news wore off, and I'm just going to go find somebody new to give me that new attention. Mm-hmm. And when it wears off, I'm going to go to the next one. And it's just, you're constantly seeking acceptance. There's a lot of things that you're probably looking for at that point.
Yep. The most troubling and widely documented relationship was with Trina McLeod. When McElroy met her, she was just 12 years old, still in the 8th grade. He was in his mid-30s. So this has been going on for a long time. So
yeah, it's like I said, it's going to get a little dark at this point, but it's just, it was a different time, but that does not excuse.
Right. Well, I think it was my great-grandparents. He was 21 and she was 14 or 15.
It happened a lot more back then.
They married and they were together like 60 years or 70 years, whatever.
It was different. I don't necessarily condone it still because just, the age difference and the fact that they're not fully developed mentally and everything. Mm-hmm. It's just, I don't know. It's kind of a gray area. In this point, I think in history, though, you're getting towards the end of that being acceptable.
What followed, according to accounts and court records, was a pattern of repeated abuse and coercion. Trina's parents initially resisted the relationship, recognizing the danger, but the resistance was met with escalation. It was alleged that McElroy burned down their home and shot the family dog. Acts meant not just to punish, but to send a clear message. And the message worked. Trina became pregnant at 14. She dropped out of school and moved in with McElroy, living alongside him and at one point his existing wife. In a calculated move to avoid statutory rape charges, McElroy divorced his previous wife and married Trina, knowing she was the key witness against him. By turning her into his wife, he effectively neutralized the case, but marriage didn't bring safety. It reinforced control.
And I don't know when they started making to where you couldn't testify against your wife or your husband, and it sounds like in the 30s that was kind of already in place. But it doesn't really change the fact that she's 14, if you're married or not. If your parents sign over or not, it really doesn't change the fact that the police probably should have done something.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, but this is just a long line of seeing how you can get away with whatever's going on. At one point, just 16 days after giving birth, Trina fled with another of McElroy's wives, seeking refuge with her parents. For a brief moment, it appeared she may have escaped, but McElroy tracked them down, brought them back, and reasserted control. In another alleged act of retaliation, he burnt down her parents' home again and shot their new dog. Like, salt of the earth, man. This is the kind of person this guy is. He's just not somebody you want to cross. Like, don't even want to be around. This pattern wasn't isolated to one relationship. Across his marriages and encounters, there were repeated accounts of manipulation, coercion, and abuse. Younger women, power imbalances, threats, and control defined his personal life. Children were born into instability, into environments shaped by fear and dominance rather than care. So can you imagine how these kids, when they were around him, like how their lives were? They probably were in fear. They weren't, we talked about earlier, just me and you, that, off the record, just when you kind of get parents that are doing that, you see it in the kids, It's not, I'm not going to say it's not their fault, but that's all they know. That's what they're brought up into. That's what's normal to them. And it should never be normal. Even outside his immediate household, the same tactics appeared. In one instance, following his indictment in the early 1970s, Trina and her child were placed in foster care in Maryville, every place says this stuff different, Missouri. McElroy responded by sitting outside the foster home for hours, watching, waiting. He reportedly told the foster family he would trade a girl for a girl to get his child back, making it clear that he knew where their daughters went to school, how they got there. It just wasn't a threat. It was a demonstration of his reach.
Is this guy working at this time?
Not doing anything productive, right. I don't think.
Yeah.
How do you get money to keep doing this and raising these kids? I'm going to put my wife to work. What emerges from all this is not just a man who's committing crimes, but a man who exercised control at every level of his life. Publicly through intimidation and violence, privately through manipulation and abuse. There was no separation between the two. Those same traits made him feared in Skidmore and made him even more dangerous at home.
And for those closest to him, there was no courtroom to turn to, no system that could intervene effectively. Just like the rest of town, they were left navigating a reality where resistance came with consequences, and where escape was never guaranteed. By the time the events of the early 1980s began to unfold, Ken Rex McElroy wasn't just seen as a criminal, he was seen as someone who controlled everything around him, people, situations, outcomes, and that perception would play a critical role in what came next. By 1980, after years of unchecked behavior, intimidation, and a justice system that seemed incapable of holding him accountable, Ken Rex McElroy had already pushed the limits of what the town of Skidmore could endure. But it was a relatively small and almost ordinary incident that would finally ignite the chain of events leading to his downfall. It began inside a local grocery store owned by Ernest Bo Bowenkamp, a 70-year-old grocer who, like many in Skidmore, had spent years living under the shadow of McElroy's reputation. The initial conflict was minor. One of McElroy's children was accused of stealing candy. In most places, it would have been handled with a warning or a quiet resolution, but in Skidmore, when it involved McElroy, nothing stayed small. The situation escalated quickly, words were exchanged, and tensions rose. And what might have ended as a simple dispute instead became personal. In the days that followed, McElroy began targeting the Bowenkamp family the same way he had targeted others before, through intimidation.
He stalked them, watched them, made his presence known in ways that were impossible to ignore. The message, once again, was clear. Pushing back would come with consequences. And then that threat turned into action. In a confrontation inside the store, McElroy, armed with a shotgun, faced Bowenkamp directly. What happened next shattered any illusion that his behavior was limited to intimidation. He fired, striking Bowenkamp in the neck, a devastating injury that could have been easily fatal. Bowenkamp collapsed, wounded and bleeding, as the reality of the situation began to set in. Luckily, he survived, and that survival changed everything. For the first time in years, the violence wasn't just implied. It was undeniable. There was a rumor, a suspicion, or whispered accusations. Or it wasn't rumor, speculation. Nothing. It was reality. It was an act witnessed that crossed the line, even in a town that had grown accustomed to fear. This time, the justice system finally responded. McElroy was arrested and charged with first-degree assault, a serious enough to carry possibly life in prison. And unlike previous cases, this one didn't immediately fall apart. Witnesses came forward. Testimonies were held. The weight of the incident, combined with the growing frustration within the community, seemed to push the system forward in a way that it hadn't been before.
In June of 1981, Ken Rex McElroy was convicted of second-degree assault and sentenced to life in prison? No. 10 years in prison?
No.
How about 5 years in prison?
Nope.
2 years in prison. For the people of Skidmore, it felt like something that they hadn't experienced in a long time, relief. After decades of fear, silence, and watching case after case collapse, they were finally a sense of accountability had arrived. That the cycle had been broken, that the man who had dominated their lives for so long would finally be removed from the equation. For a brief moment, it seemed like justice had worked. But that moment didn't last, because what happened next would prove something the people of Skidmore had already begun to suspect. Even when the system succeeded, it still wasn't enough. But that sense of justice was fragile. Almost immediately after his conviction in June of 1981, McElroy filed an appeal, and while that process moved forward, he was granted bond, meaning he would not serve his sentence right away. Instead of being removed from the town, he was released. And he came back, not quietly, not cautiously, but openly and with the same confidence that he had defined him for many years because of his behavior. If anything, his return seemed to carry a message. Even a conviction hadn't stopped him. For the people of Skidmore, whatever relief they had felt quickly turned into something else. Frustration, disbelief, and a deepening sense that nothing would ever change. The system had done its job, and still he was back in their streets, back in their lives, and back in control.
And almost immediately the pattern resumed. Reports surfaced that McElroy began targeting those who were connected to his conviction, particularly one Ernest Bowenkamp, the man that he shot. There were claims of continued harassment, renewed threats, and behavior that suggested the situation was far from over. Others in the community had cooperated with authorities, also felt the pressure. The same tactics, watching, following, and making his presence known. Fear, which he had briefly loosened its grip, came rushing back stronger than ever. Then on June 30th, 1981, just days after his release, McElroy made another move that would send a clear and chilling signal to the entire town. He walked into the D&G Tavern, one of the central gathering spots in Skidmore, armed with an M1 Grand rifle with a bayonet. He wasn't hiding this. He carried it openly, visibly, and making sure everybody in that room knew exactly what he was capable of. And according to multiple accounts, he didn't keep his intentions quiet. He made graphic threats about what he had planned to do to Bowen Camp. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't implied. This was direct. For those who heard it, the message was unmistakable. The violence wasn't close to being over. It was escalating. The moment inside the tavern became a turning point, not because of what happened physically, but because of what it represented. The system had intervened, it had convicted him, and attempted to impose consequences. And still, he stood there, armed, making threats as if nothing had ever happened. Because in his mind, nothing had.
For the people of Skidmore, something shifted. The belief that the legal system could protect them, already weakened, began to collapse entirely. The idea that waiting, reporting, or cooperating would lead to safety no longer held. It no longer held weight. Instead, a different question began to take shape. Quietly at first, then more openly. If the system couldn't stop him, who would? And by early July of 1981, that equation was no longer theoretical, it was becoming urgent. By the time Ken Rex McElroy returned to Skidmore after his conviction, something fundamentally had already changed within the town. For years, fear had shaped behavior, kept people quiet, cautious, compliant. But now that fear was colliding with something else: frustration, exhaustion, and a growing sense that the situation had gone on far too long. This wasn't just about one incident or one victim anymore. It was the accumulation of years, decades of intimidation threats and violence that had never been truly addressed. Families had been harassed, property destroyed, people followed, watched, and made to feel unsafe in their own homes. And each time the system failed, that frustration deepened. The message was unavoidable. Nothing was going to stop him. And for many in Skidmore, that realization was the breaking point. Conversations that had once been whispered began happening more openly. People who had stayed silent for years started expressing something they had kept buried for far too long. And that was anger. Not just at McElroy, but at the system that had failed to protect them.
There was something growing. Belief that they had been left to deal with the situation on their own. And that responsibility for safety had quietly shifted from law enforcement to the community itself. The phrase, "something has to be done," began to take hold. Not necessarily as a plan, but as a feeling. A shared understanding that the certain reality was unsustainable. The waiting for another court date, another trial, and another failure was no longer an option that people were willing to accept. It's important to understand that this shift didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where the entire town decided collectively. Instead, it built gradually, shaped by conversations and experiences, and the shared history of fear. Different people likely felt in different ways, some angry, some desperate, some were just simply tired and wore out of it. But the direction was all the same. For years, McElroy had controlled the dynamic. He dictated how people behaved, how they spoke, how they lived. By now, for the first time, that control was being challenged. Not through the legal system, but through something far less defined, less structured, and way more unpredictable. A community that had spent years avoiding confrontation was starting to move towards it, not recklessly and not loudly, but steadily. And the morning of July 10th, 1981, that shifted. And that shift would come into focus because what had been building quietly across the years, the fear, the failures, the frustrations, the 3 F's, the 3 F's of Skidmore, was about to converge into a single place at a single time.
On the morning of July 10th, 1981, the growing tension of Skidmore found a focal point. Residents gathered at the American Legion Hall, a central meeting place in town, to discuss what could be done about McElroy. This wasn't an official court proceeding or even a formal legal assembly. It was just a community meeting, but given everything that had led up to that moment, it carried far more weight than an ordinary discussion. People came with the same concerns they had carried for years: fear, frustration, and a deep sense that they had been left without protection. The recent events, McElroy's conviction, his release on bond, his return to the town, and his open threats had intensified everything. Whatever patience the town once had was running out. Nodaway County Sheriff Dan Estes was present at the meeting. Their accounts differ on exactly how involved he was and what was said. Some describe the gathering as relatively calm, focused on legal options and ways to protect the community without escalating the situation. Others recall a more tense atmosphere, voices raised, emotions high, and a clear sense that the situation had reached a critical point. What is generally agreed upon is that Estes advised against direct confrontation. He reportedly encouraged the group to consider forming a neighborhood watch, something structured, something within the bounds of the law. It was in many ways a continuation of the same approach that had been suggested before. Work within the system, avoid escalation, and maintain order.
But for many in that room, that advice felt disconnected from reality because the system, as they experienced it, hadn't worked. At some point during or shortly after this meeting, word spread that McElroy was in town, and he was at the D&G Tavern with his wife, Trina. That information changed the dynamic immediately. The conversation was no longer
casual, like
I was looking for a more exciting word. Theatrical. I don't know if that's what I want to use. The problem they had gathered to discuss wasn't somewhere else. It was right in front of them. Sheriff Estes eventually left the meeting, reportedly drove out of town in his patrol car. What that departure meant and how it was interpreted has been debated ever since.
He's like something. It's like when the townspeople went to get Frankenstein. Like, I'm getting out of here because I don't want to know what's going on.
Something's brewing, and I don't want to get mixed up in it. I don't want to be part of it. Don't want my name involved.
I don't want to miss out on the next election.
Exactly. So he booked it. Some see it as routine, others as significant. But what matters the most is what happens next. The people who had gathered didn't disperse. Instead, they moved together. Not as a chaotic mob, not in a panic, but with purpose. The group made their way to D&G Tavern, where McElroy was. As they arrived, the bar began to fill. People gathered inside and outside. The town, in a sense, converged into a single location. And while there was no recorded plan, no confirmed agreements, something had clearly shifted. That distance between action, that distance between discussion and action closed.
Kind of reminds me of those old Western movies where there's going to be a duel at high noon, and all the
town ain't big enough for the both
and all the
of
townspeople gather around outside, right?
Wah, wah, wah.
By early afternoon on July 10th, 1981. Are you sure that's 1981, Dustin? Is that 1981?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Like 60 years later? Okay.
I think.
Everything in Skidmore had narrowed to a single place, the D&G Tavern. Inside and around it were dozens of townspeople. many of whom had just come from the meeting at the American Legion Hall. The tension that had been building for years was no longer beneath the surface. It was present, visible, and waiting. Inside the tavern, Ken Rex McElroy sat drinking with his wife Trina. To him, it was probably just like any other day, another moment where he could just move through town without any consequence. If he noticed the growing crowd, the usual people, gathering around there, there's no clear record of how he could have interpreted it. But outside, something was different. People weren't just passing through. They were staying, watching, and time dragged on. Eventually, McElroy stood up and walked out of the tavern. He carried with him a 6-pack of beer he had just purchased. Trina followed. They stepped out into the daylight into a space where dozens of people were present, some standing nearby, others positioned at a distance, but all well within view. He walked to his red pickup truck and got inside, taking the driver's seat. Trina climbed in beside him. The truck sat there, parked on the main street, not hidden, not isolated, but exposed. Around them, between 30 and 46 people stood within the immediate area.
I like the certainty of the 30 to
46. In a town the size of Skidmore, that wasn't just a crowd. It was a significant portion of the community. And then gunfire. The first shot cracked through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Then another, and possibly more, fired in quick succession. The sound shattered the stillness of the afternoon, echoing across the buildings and through the gathered crowd. Inside the truck, McElroy was hit. One bullet, a center fire round, struck him with force. Another, a .22 caliber round, hit as well. The use of 2 different types of ammunition strongly suggested more than one weapon, and most likely more than one shooter.
Well, so we know more than one weapon.
Well, I just hope nothing happened to his wife.
Yeah,
they could have shot him on the way out and not.
She's kind of in a bad situation.
Yeah, she's like Bonnie and Clyde, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's in a bad situation because even if you're forced, like you are young and impressionable, and you assume that's what love is, and you think you're in love, even though he's a monster, and you live in fear. But if you're nice to him,
well, how often do we see that today? Oh, he beats me, but he loves me.
Yeah, you want to press charges? No, I can't. He
yeah.
loves me. So his body reacted instantly, jerking from the impact before he collapsed over the steering wheel of the truck. It was over in seconds. This wasn't a prolonged struggle. No chance to react. After years of escalation, confrontation, and fear, the end came quickly and almost abruptly. Trina, seated beside him, was suddenly covered in blood. She scrambled out of the truck, screaming, disoriented, trying to process exactly what just happened. Around them, the crowd remained. And what followed was perhaps more unsettling than the shooting itself. There was no chaos. There was no rush forward, no frantic attempts to intervene, no immediate cries to identify the shooter. The people who had been there, they had all witnessed this entire event. They didn't react in a way that most people would expect. Instead, they stood, they watched, and silence began to take over the scene. Because in that moment after these shots, Ken Rex McElroy lay slumped over the steering wheel in his truck. Something unspoken moved through the crowd. In the seconds after the gunfire, the scene in Skidmore, it should have erupted into chaos. A man had just been shot to death in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, on the main street of this small town. Under normal circumstances, there would have been a panic. People rushing forward, shouting, calling for help, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. No. Not here. But what happened instead, when the aftermath unfolded in a way that was almost unnervingly controlled, Ken Rex McElroy remained slumped over the steering wheel of his truck, motionless. The reality of his death was immediate and unmistakable. There was no frantic attempt to save him, no desperate effort to render any aid. No one ran to pull him from the vehicle to check for signs of life. No one called an ambulance.
Well, we didn't have a lot of smartphones back then, right? Law enforcement would arrive to a scene that on the surface looked almost ordinary, except for the fact that a man had just been shot to death in his truck. Witnesses were everywhere. Potential accounts surrounded the event from every angle. By all logic, this should have been one of the most straightforward investigations imaginable. Dozens of people had seen it happen. But almost immediately, something became clear. When authorities began asking questions, simple, direct questions about what had just taken place, the answers never came. People claimed that they hadn't seen anything. They hadn't heard anything. They don't know who fired the shots. Even those who had been standing just feet away offered nothing that could move the investigation forward. There were no clear descriptions, no identifications, no usable statements. The same people who had just witnessed a public killing now presented a wall of uncertainty. Or perhaps something else. Because the lack of response didn't feel like confusion, it felt like silence. And that silence began almost immediately, taking a hold of the scene before investigators could even begin to piece together what had happened. What should have been a chaotic, information-rich environment instead became something far more difficult to navigate. A crime with witnesses, and no one was willing to speak. In that moment, the trajectory of the case shifted. What might have been solvable in hours or days suddenly became something else entirely. Because without cooperation and without any testimony and without any identification, there was nothing really to build on.
One of the most striking aspects of the silence was the position of Trina, McElroy herself. She had been sitting in the passenger seat inches away from her husband when he was shot. She experienced the moment more directly than anybody else, and yet even she refused to identify the shooter. Whether that decision was rooted in fear, trauma, loyalty, or something else entirely has never fully been understood. But her silence mattered because the one person closest to the act wouldn't speak. It reinforced what everyone else was already doing. Investigators were left in an impossible position. In most cases, witness testimonies formed the backbone of their investigation, especially in a situation with this many potential witnesses. But in Skidmore, the foundation was it simply didn't exist. There was no statements to collaborate, no conflicting accounts to analyze. There was no leads to follow. And what makes it more unusual is how consistent that void remained over time. This wasn't a momentary reaction, something that faded as the shock wore off. Days, weeks, months passed. Nobody came forward. No one broke ranks. No one decided to tell a different version of events. The silence held. To outsiders, it was baffling. How could an entire group of people witness a killing and collectively refuse to speak about it? But within Skidmore, the answer may have been more complex and more deeply rooted into the town's history. For years, silence became a survival mechanism. People had learned not to speak out, not to challenge, and not to risk becoming a target. That habit, built over those decades and living under McElroy's intimidation, didn't disappear the moment he was gone. If anything, it evolved. What had once been used to protect individuals from him now seemed to be a way to protect the community. So, nobody spoke.
And because no one spoke, the case stalled almost immediately. What remained wasn't just an unsolved murder, it was something far more unusual. A crime witnessed by dozens, preserved not by lack of evidence, but by a collective decision not to provide it. A silence that wasn't empty. In the immediate aftermath of the killing of Ken Rex McElroy, law enforcement faced what should have been a straightforward case. A man had been shot to death in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses in the center of a small town. Under normal circumstances, this level of exposure would make an investigation easier, faster even. But almost from the start, it became clear that this case would be anything but simple. Local authorities began their work by interviewing witnesses, canvassing the scene, and attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events. Physically, there were some facts that they could establish. McElroy had been struck by at least 2 bullets, one from a center fire weapon and another from a .22 caliber firearm. That detail alone raised immediate questions. It suggested the possibility of more than one shooter, or at the very least, more than one weapon involved in this killing. But beyond the physical evidence, the case had very little to stand on, because the one thing investigators needed most, which was witness testimony, was completely absent. Dozens of people had been present. Many had been close enough to see exactly what happened, and yet, when they questioned people, they all gave the same response. I didn't see who fired the shots. I can't identify anyone. They all had non-useful information to provide to the police. Without statements, investigators had no way to connect a suspect to the act. The case quickly expanded beyond local law enforcement. Given the unusual nature of the crime and the complete lack of cooperation, state authorities became involved.
Eventually, the case drew attention from the federal, the FBI. The idea that a public killing witnessed by so many could produce no actionable leads was highly unusual. The deeply concerned, from a legal standpoint, a grand jury was convened in an effort to push the case forward. The hope was that under oath, within formal legal settings, someone might break from the silence, that the pressure of the process might compel a witness to speak, or at least provide enough information to identify a suspect. But that didn't happen. The silence continued to hold. Witnesses who appeared before the grand jury maintained the same position they had from the beginning. No one identified a shooter. No one offered new details. No one provided any kind of testimony that could support any type of indictment. And without that, the legal system had nowhere to go. Prosecutors required evidence that could stand with court. Statements, identifications, connections that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But in this case, that number of people present, none of that existed in a usable form. There were suspicions, of course. Names have circulated privately, but suspicion wasn't enough to bring charges. At one point, an individual publicly accused Trina McElroy in a civil lawsuit. But even that accusation did not lead to criminal charges. There simply wasn't enough evidence to support prosecution. Without cooperation from witnesses, there was no way to build a stronger case. The district attorney ultimately declined to press charges. The federal investigation, despite its scope, reached the same conclusion. No indictments, no arrests, no one held legally responsible for the killing of Ken Rex McElroy. I do kind of funny that Trina was publicly accusing people, because that becomes a slippery slope. And I do believe, I don't think we're going to cover it, but I think that she did get a lawsuit that she won. But, what are you going to do? It's
right. What remained was a case that on paper made little sense. A murder with dozens of witnesses, but no testimony, physical evidence suggesting multiple shooters, but no suspects. A community at the center of it all, but unwilling to engage with a process meant to deliver justice. It wasn't just a failure to solve a crime, it was a breakdown of the system itself. Because the law depends on participation, on people coming forward, telling the truth, engaging with the process. And in Skidmore, that participation never came. Leaving behind something rare, not just an unsolved murder, but one that may never be solved at all, with no arrest, no indictments, and no witness testimony to anchor the investigation. The killing of Ken Rex McElroy quickly moved out of the realm of solvable cases and into something else entirely, interpretation. In the absence of answers, theories filled the space. And unlike many unsolved cases where speculation drifts into the abstract, the theories surrounding this case are grounded in something very real. A known location, a defined group of witnesses, and a shared history of fear. The question isn't just what happened, it's how something like this could happen so publicly and still remain unsolved.
Over time, several primary theories had emerged. One possibility is that a single individual pulled the trigger, In this version, someone, likely a member of the community, reached their personal breaking point after years of intimidation, threats, and violence. They acted alone. The shooting wasn't coordinated or discussed in advance. It was also entirely unexpected. It was the result of pressure building over time, finally released in a single moment. Supporters of the theory often point to the idea that it wouldn't take a group to carry this act out. Just one person willing to do what others wouldn't. In a town where many had reasons to fear or resent McElroy, that kind of motivation wasn't hard to imagine. The silence of the town, in this case, becomes a form of protection. Not necessarily because everyone knew in advance, but because once it had happened, no one willing was willing to identify the person responsible. This guy put you through hell, like your whole life or half your life. Why are you going to give up who ended it? Another widely discussed theory centers on the physical evidence. Ken Rex McElroy was struck by two different types of ammunition, a centerfire round and a .22 caliber bullet. That detail has led many to believe that there was more than one firearm used, but by extension, possibly more than one shooter. If true, this suggests a different kind of event, not a spontaneous act, but something shared. Whether planned or not, multiple individuals may have fired shots at the same moment, each contributing to the outcome. This theory aligns with reports that the gunfire sounded more like a single shot, possibly coming from different directions. In a crowd of dozens, it would have been possible for more than one person to act, especially if the moment unfolded quickly.
JFK, anybody?
Chrissy, no.
If there were multiple shooters, it complicates the investigation even further, because now the silence just isn't protecting one person, it's protecting several. And this is perhaps the most commonly discussed and most controversial theory, that what happened in Skidmore was an act of vigilant justice. In this version, the town didn't necessarily plan every detail of the shooting, but there was a shared understanding that something had to be done. Years of failed prosecution, intimidation, and fear had created a situation where the legal system no longer felt capable of resolving the problem. So, the community, in some form, resolved it themselves, not through a formal agreement, not through a vote or a declared plan, but through a collective mindset, an unspoken acceptance that if something happened, no one would interfere. And I bet that's probably what that meeting was about when the sheriff said, I'm out of here, right? The silence then becomes more than protection. It becomes participation, because even those who don't pull a trigger still chose not to speak.
If I hear gunshots, I have to react. Well, if you go out and take Route 9 about 15 minutes and then stop, it will be done by the time you get back.
A more structured version of events suggests that the shooter was not spontaneous at all, but organized. According to this theory, the meeting in the American Legion Hall wasn't just a discussion. Here we go. That's what I was thinking. It was the moment where a decision was made. Specific individuals may have been chosen or may have even volunteered.
What do we want? Freedom. How are we going to get it? We're going to kill the bastard.
Well,
who's wanting to pull the trigger? I don't care. All of us.
What about the guy that he shot in the neck with the shotgun, the 70-year-old? I wonder if he had any kids that wanted some vigilante justice, right?
I think there's a lot of people that maybe the parents of the wives and the daughters that were married to the guy that married to him, that they burnt down their barns and shot their animals. Maybe one of his own
kids. You never know. Roles may have been understood, and when the group moved to the D&G Tavern, it wasn't just to observe, but to act. This would explain the coordination implied by multiple gunshots, as well as the immediate and consistent silence that followed. If a plan had been established, then the refusal to cooperate would have been part of the plan from the very beginning. However, there is no direct evidence confirming this level of organization. Of course there's not going to be evidence. It remains a theory built from interference, timing, and the behavior of the crowd. Perhaps the most enduring theory is also the simplest, that the identity of the shooter or shooters is known within Skidmore, not publicly, and definitely not officially, but privately within the community itself. In a town that small with that many witnesses, it's difficult to imagine that no one recognized anything. A stance, a movement, a position, something that would indicate who was responsible. And yet, decades later, that information has never surfaced in a way that could be acted upon, which leads to the idea that the silence isn't based on ignorance, but on choice. That people know or believe they know what happened and have decided collectively or individually to keep it that way.
Each of these theories attempt to explain the same set of facts: a public killing, multiple witnesses, and no cooperation or charges. None of them can be proven definitively, and that's what makes this case so unusual. Because the question isn't just who did it, it's how an entire community could stand there in the middle of it and ignore it, and leave behind nothing but possibilities. To understand what happened in Skidmore on July 10th, 1981, you can't just look at the shooting of Ken Rex McElroy. You have to look at what came before it. Because fear wasn't just in the background in the story. It was the foundation. It shaped the behavior, it controlled decisions, and ultimately influenced how an entire community would respond in its most critical moment. In the case of Ken Rex McElroy, I don't know how you want me to say it. I'm still going to say it wrong. It isn't about a killing. It's about a boundary, the line between order and chaos, between system and reaction, between justice as defined by law and justice as felt by the people. What happened on that quiet stretch of road in the small Missouri town quickly spread outward, capturing regional attention at first and then national. And it even got some international attention. Because the facts alone were enough to draw headlines. A man shot in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, and no one's willing to say who did it. It's the kind of story that just didn't happen. Like, this type of stuff is unheard of. It raised questions. Major media outlets began to cover the case, trying to make sense of how somebody so public could remain so unresolved. In 1982, 60 Minutes aired a segment on the killing, bringing the story into the living rooms across America. For the viewers, it was their first exposure to Skidmore, and what they saw challenged expectations about law, order, and community behavior. The reaction was mixed. Some saw a town's silence as shocking and even disturbing. The idea that dozens of people could witness a murder and collectively refuse to cooperate with authorities raised concern about the rule of law. It suggests a breakdown, not just of a single case, but of the entire system itself. Others saw something different. They saw a community that had been pushed to its limits, a place where the legal system had failed them repeatedly, leaving the residents to deal with a situation they couldn't ever escape. Like I said, he'd get arrested. He'd get on probation. They'd try to put something on him. It wouldn't stick. He'd get out of it. That wouldn't be reported because they feared him. Even, like I said, the police obviously didn't want to deal with it. They were afraid of probably retaliation as well. In this context, the silent wasn't obstruction. It was to some, it was an act of solidarity.
The debate quickly expanded beyond Skidmore. Legal experts, journalists, and the public began asking broader questions. Was this case a case of vigilant justice? Or was it a dangerous precedent? Or an extreme but undesirable response to years of unchecked behavior? The story became a kind of cultural touch point. Reference and discussions about rural justice, community dynamics, and the limits of the legal system. It challenged the assumption that the law on its own is always enough to maintain order. Over time, the case continued to resurface in media and pulp culture. In Broad Daylight by Harry N. McLean offered a detailed account of the events and environment that led to them bringing a new depth to the story. That book would later be adapted into a television film, further expanding its reach. Documentaries revisited this case, including No One Saw a Thing, which explored not just the killing itself, but the lingering impact on the town and the people who live there. Shows like BuzzFeed Unsolved introduced the story to newer audiences, framing it within the broader world of unsolved mysteries. Even outside traditional true crime media, the case found its way into music, television, and stage productions. It became more than a local story. It became a narrative people return to when discussing justice, silence, and the power of community.
And through all that coverage, one thing remained consistent: no answers. No matter how many times the story was told, analyzed, or even debated, the central mystery never changed. The identity of the person or persons who killed Ken Rex McElroy still remains unknown, or at least unconfirmed. Over the years, as new generations grew up in the town, the story became something and was passed down, not always in detail and not always direct, but a part of a collective memory, a moment that defined a place, even for those who hadn't been there to witness it. At the same time, the lack of resolution meant the case has never truly closed. There was no trial, no verdict, no official conclusion that allowed the town or the broader public to move on in a traditional sense. Instead, the story remained open-ended, revisited again and again and again through media coverage, books, documentaries, and discussions about justice and community. And every time it's told, it's resurfaced, it's brought back the same questions. What really happened that day? Who was responsible? And why did nobody ever say a thing? For Skidmore, those questions exist alongside everyday life, unanswered, unresolved, but not forgotten. Because even though the fear that was once defined by a town may be gone, the story of Ken Rex McElroy is still there, woven into the identity of Skidmore. Quiet, unspoken, but always present. So it's amazing that the system failed so much, but at some point the town we're going to unify and just end this. Like, we want to get back to life. And I'm sure it's helped some tourism for that town, for people to come in because you see it on TV, but it also probably makes it shine in a backwoods, dumb, kind of hillbilly, lawless, not a place that you'd really want to go. And it sucks that stigma is going to stick to that town for a while, because the people who live there deserve to have closure and move on. And they got it. They just didn't get it officially.
Well, I'm surprised the law enforcement didn't arrest every single person there in the crowd.
like
right?
Your mom,
like Andy Griffith, where Barney arrested the entire town. Remember?
You know what? I remember my mom saying, "You know what? I'll whip all of you, and I'll get the one that did it."
Yeah. So you better tell me now, right? But I'm just saying, what they say, one was a 22 and the other one was a what?
Like a center fire. So
a 22, that's a long gun, right?
Rifle? You can get 22 handguns, but it's probably a long rifle.
So
small caliber, but it does damage.
Unless somebody left, you know what I mean? Left the scene, or if they had a wagon or car or whatever, bed of a truck, snuck it in there, put it in the back of the bar, where the D&G bar, or stuck it behind a trash can.
I'm sure
something.
Gun was in a car, and you just guys walked out and you grabbed it and just
right,
boom. And like I said, the town got their closure, and like I said, it didn't sound like his wife for a while wasn't overly mad about it, but then went back to sue. And I think she got a settlement, but it's one of those, she lived through hell, like 12 years old. Like, you're not going to tell me that a 30-year-old man is not going to intimidate a 12-year-old girl.
Right.
And to turn that into a relationship is just, I don't even want to think about it. Like, I made sure that, like, my wording on some of that stuff was not as dark as it was, because it's just like, you don't want to get in that mindset. But like I said, it's, I don't believe in playing God, but sometimes I think vigilante justice has to take place because the government's not going to do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, you don't condone it, but I understand.
Mm-hmm.
So, we want to thank you guys for coming in, sitting with us, and letting us listen to us ramble on about weird cases. Like always, you can kind of hop on the interwebs and go to Facebook and find us at Dark Discoveries Podcast. You can find in the private group or the page, and who knows, we may be doing some TikToks at Dark Discoveries Podcast.
Don't lie to the people. You're never.
I'm trying to get better.
No, you're not.
I'm trying to get better. I love.
Oh, why'd you scroll an extra 20 minutes last night instead of posting something?
all our listeners, and I appreciate everybody. I really do, who listens to us. It blows me away. Today, this is probably a month before it gets released. We got downloads in like Iraq today, and
I've seen some in Vietnam.
Like
I was like, wow.
It baffles me when you look at the, and it's not going to be like a whole country's listening to us. That would be awesome. But when I look at the map of who's listened to us, and you get Vietnam, Guyana, we said, we had South Korea. We're still working on North Korea, guys. I want North Korea worse than anything.
You want Kim Jong-un himself to be like, this is the official podcast of North Korea? Is that what you want, Dustin?
I'll take it, because that's all they can listen to. And just this week, Japan, Iraq, Indonesia, Georgia, not the state, but the country, Colombia, Bangladesh, Australia, Argentina, Vietnam.
Yeah.
Vietnam, whatever. That's just this week. And there's way more. Canada, Europe. It's just amazing that you guys listen to us, and we are very thankful. And if you want to suggest a topic, if
there's something crazy in your country or in a town you live in, let us know. An unsolved murder, serial killer.
darkdiscoveriespod@gmail.com. We will take
UFO sighting. We don't care.
We will take user suggestions, because we want to make this as good for you and as fun for you as it is for us to get together and to blow off some steam and escape reality. So I just want to say thank you again. I'm rambling on. Jimbo's over here. Land the plane.
The plane, boss, the plane.
Get in the chopper. But it's been a blast. And I just want you guys to remember one thing. The deeper you dive,
the darker it gets.